Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Cooler Heads with me, Rabbi Scott Weiss, and George Schwartz. Good afternoon, George.
Afternoon, Rabbi. I hear you've had quite the day, huh?
It has been a day. It has been a day. It's appropriate. It's, Purim. And
That's
so Purim is tonight. Purim is actually a great way to sort of frame this experience, this moment. You know, the joke, of course, that you've heard people say, and I'm sure you've probably heard me say it, the joke is, most Jewish holidays, it's about, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, right? You know, and I used to laugh at it more than I do today. But, when it becomes a little bit too close to home, it's not as funny. Also reminds me of that, there's that Alan Alda, Alan Alda plays the character in what's it called? The Woody Allen movie.
You're on your own on this one.
All right,
I don't know.
he says he's a director, and he says tragedy plus time equals comedy, right? So it makes sense, right? Crimes and Misdemeanors. That's the movie I was trying to remember. But when it is so close to home, when it is so recent, it doesn't feel as funny. So nonetheless, we're gonna be going tonight with lots of frivolity to celebrate Purim. But what I'd like to do is start at an issue that I know has made quite a few heads explode of late. And that is this issue about this man named Mahmoud Khalil, a recently graduate student at the university, at Columbia University. Let's, George, why don't you set the stage for us?
So let's talk about what we know for sure. Mahmoud Khalil is a foreign-born legal U.S. resident, a green card holder of Palestinian descent. He's been here for a few years. He graduated from Columbia in December, I believe it was, and he's been staying in the Columbia dorms ever since. He was one of the central leading figures of these, we'll call it a kind of a low wattage pogrom that's been taking place in slow motion on Columbia's campus. He was one of the main organizers and the lead negotiator for this illegal encampment in Columbia's quad, and this ongoing campaign to threaten, harass, and intimidate the Jews of Columbia University. So he's taken that green card that we gave him and used this as an opportunity to harass American citizens and disseminate enemy terrorist propaganda from Hamas and Hezbollah. I think that sums up his resume rather nicely.
Okay, so that's pretty heavy duty. But here's the thing. So, growing up in the Jewish community, one of the things that we were, taught about is, this moment when American Nazis wanted to march right in Skokie, Illinois, and it became a big story. And one of the things that was such a powerful part of that moment was that people who were on the liberal side of things, definitely Jewish individuals, were standing up for the rights of these Nazis to march in Skokie. And the whole notion is, right, they have to have the right to be numbskulls. They have to have the right to be mean and nasty and ugly in public in order to maintain this sacred recognition of freedom of speech, which is, of course, enshrined in our Constitution.
Well, I mean, the First Amendment, it just shouldn't take very much imagination to see why the First Amendment is of such keen importance to the Jewish community. It's what gives us the right to worship in peace. It's what forbids the government to benefit one religion over another. And it also protects speech when it does no harm. It's just egregious. So although we don't like it, Americans who are Nazis, who are members of the Ku Klux Klan, they are entitled to their opinion. And if they just express their vile opinions, at the end of the day, we don't really have to have any legal recourse because they're American citizens and they're not actively trying to harm anybody. We kind of
That's
have to put up with
yes.
them just as they have to put up with us
Right.
because hey, we're Americans. We share this country at the end of the day.
Got it.
Um,
Hmm.
Mahmoud Khalil, I see this as a very separate case because, first of all, he is not an American citizen. Now, that does not mean that he's not entitled to First Amendment speech protection, but it does change what we can do about him when he does violate the law. We can't deport the KKK. We can deport a foreigner who breaks the terms of his guest status in our country. And I would say that there is actually a good legal case to be made that he has violated those terms. Um, Under US code, an alien is inadmissible to the US if he endorses or espouses terrorist activity or is a representative of a political, social, or other group that endorses or espouses terrorist activity. I'm drawing directly from the statute there. So honestly, we probably never should have admitted this guy to our country to begin with.
Hmm.
And it's not too late to just correct the mistake and deport him back to wherever he came from.
So, George,
So
are you saying, well, let me ask you, you're so, it sounds like you're saying that there are certain things that you have to agree to do or not do in order to like be given, in order to apply for and be granted a green card.
absolutely right. And I went through this with my wife when she earned her green card. You know, they had to make sure that she wasn't a part of any terrorist or paramilitary organizations before coming here.
Right.
And I'll say that's not too much to ask. This is our country. We do have the right to decide who does and doesn't belong here.
You know, it's interesting in Jewish tradition, um, there's, I mean, look, we had 2,000 years to establish Jewish legal thought on the subjects, like, for example, on speech. Um, Different than once there's a state, and now the state has to become the organ of these rights and obligations. But it's super interesting I was just looking through and just taking some notes and just reminding myself, in Jewish tradition, there's always this notion of rights and obligations, right? And the two go hand in hand. And I think that that is very much true when it comes to American law as well, right? There is this notion of we have the right to speak and say and do and act, right? Where we have the right to do these things, and you can't be um, you can't be 100% free 100% of the time unless you live in a cave.
Yeah,
Right. And I kind of want to, I'm saying, I'm going down this road because I want to step back from it. You look, no one's coming to us looking for our opinion on what's going to happen with Mahmoud Khalil, right?
very true.
Whenever I think about these things, I really want to think about them in the context of our own lives. And for me, it's very powerful to ask the question, well, how would you respond, right? How would you feel if this was in your face when you were walking down campus every day and people were yelling at you and screaming at you and then not only that, but disturbing your classes, taking over buildings, right? How, there's a sense of, wait a minute, I know what my I know my obligations are. I'm here to be a student, to be a good citizen, to be cooperative, connected, supportive, right in my campus. At least throw my trash away. I mean, like I have certain like obligations, but those are important because I have rights, which are at base to be able to be, left alone. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the First Amendment does not say that you can do and say anything you want.
Right.
That is not what free speech protection says. Um, Both the U.S. and Jewish tradition understands that the irony of freedom is that freedom has to be circumscribed,
Right.
or it devolves into anarchy, which itself inevitably devolves into some kind of dictatorship. What does the Jewish tradition say, Rabbi, about limits on speech. What does the Torah and the Talmud say about this?
Well, it's probably something that we could spend the next 2 years on, but we don't have to. But we have a few minutes. So it's interesting because there's sort of five categories. There's what's called lashon hara, which is language that you shouldn't say because it's true, but it could be really harmful, right? So
So
it's
saying that your wife does look fat in that dress, for example.
exactly right. How dare you? Then there's slander, right? Slander is something that's false, and yet you're publicizing. Then there's something called tochacha, which is constructive criticism. It's sort of like, the moment when your father-in-law, gives you advice that you just have to listen to, right? Like you shouldn't be doing it this way, or you shouldn't be doing it that way, or something to that effect. Then, of course, there's pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh literally means life-saving, right? So there's nothing that you can't or shouldn't say if it would literally lead to, saving a life. And then there's something called chilul Hashem and kiddush Hashem. And the first one is desecration of God's name, and the second one is sanctification of God's name. And again, these are sort of wide slices of how you might think of speech. But I think it's super important that we keep in mind that these values come from the Torah, they come from the Bible, from which Christianity and Islam are born. And I know that most people on most every day would insist that Christianity and Islam couldn't possibly condone the sort of loud and intense bullying that is that in the public space, right? That you don't these students did not come there for that reason. And so it leads me to a question I wanted to ask you. Help us understand a little bit about the difference between the public sphere and I guess you call it the private public sphere of like a place like Columbia.
Well, I mean, just as we in the United States, we set rules that determine who does and doesn't get to come here. Columbia University, it's a private institution, and so they have their own code of conduct that determines how you have to conduct yourself in order to remain a member of good standing of the university. And this guy, Mahmoud Khalil, has repeatedly, publicly, and rather boastfully flouted that code of conduct. And Colombia has done nothing about it. They have tolerated his antics these last 18 months while American citizens who are Jews were subject to his bullying and threats and intimidation. And Columbia University enabled and put up with that. I mean, he graduated 3 months ago. Why are they still giving him an apartment so that he can continue to organize these bullying tactics on campus?
Okay, so I'm
Why?
going to
Yeah.
challenge. So look, it's up to Columbia, right? If they want to let him live there, it's a private institution. They can let him live there, right? Where I'm still struggling is to understand is I understand that Columbia should have regulated their own campus. I mean, I've been saying that for more than a year and a half. Columbia and elsewhere. And I understand that if Khalil was doing these things and organizing these things in Grand Central Park, right? Then of course the secular government, right, has a role. And this isn't the piece that they're coming down on in legally right now, by which they're allowing him to have his day in court. But what I'm curious is what role does the government have to step in to Colombia and to arrest him for actions he was engaging in, which in a private space, right? in Colombia?
Well, the government does have a duty to protect its citizens, and that duty it extends to border security. So if you have a resident alien in your country who is breaking your rules, even if they're breaking them in a private space, I mean, we would also arrest somebody who was dealing drugs out of a private space, and if he was subject to deportation, we would do that. So you have a guy who is clearly breaking the terms of his green card. He's a green card holder. In order to get that green card, he had to refuse to take part in espousing any terrorist organizations. Well, screwed that one up, didn't you, Mahmoud? So the government has the right and the duty to secure its own citizens against foreign bad actors on our soil. And that does extend to the authority to come onto private property and arrest them. So I would say that the government does have at least a legal argument to make. And
Mhm.
as you said, Mahmoud Khalil he's getting his day in court. He is getting those concerned about due process. I would say your concern is absolutely legitimate. We should
Right.
not condone anyone, even our enemies, being railroaded in the criminal justice system. But you can rest assured that, hey, the process is working. The government decided that he was a threat. The State Department, the Secretary of State decided that under his authority, his legal authority, he was going to revoke the green card. ICE agents then, under their legal authority, detained him using no more than the necessary force. A judge said, hey, wait a minute, we need to see the full facts of the case. And the agents of the executive branch of government complied. That's what's supposed to happen. I think that we should all be more comfortable than some of us evidently are that due process is being served in this case.
Okay. So as we draw this to a bit of a conclusion, I want to ask one more piece, discuss one more piece, and that is, how should this have been dealt with? Because one of the pieces that sticks in my craw is, I remember the arguments a year ago about, Columbia should act, and then the New York City Police Department were standing outside. Eventually, they went in when those students took over that building. But, you know, what do we want? What's the version of this that we want, in which we can, recognize the true sacred value of speech, right? Even speech that we might think is wrong, even speech that we might think is even hateful, right? How do we engage with this balance better? Because I don't think that either side, the right or the left, is dealing with speech in ways that are keeping true to at least the spirit of our Constitution. You've seen a lot, George. I mean, you've served in action I believe in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have fought for our country, and one of those essential elements is, this right to personal power over oneself, right? The right to speak up, the right to be to not be held, to not be thrown in jail or thrown into a pit, God forbid, because you've spoken out against someone or something. Um, how should it work, do you think, especially in this context? What could have happened differently, maybe, than we've seen over the last year and a half?
Well, so there's a lot to unpack there, I would say.
Yeah, sorry, it
And
wasn't a simple question.
no, no, and honestly, this is I was lucky that I had the chance to kind of prep this because there was a friend of mine who I served with who was asking me very similar questions about, hey, in this particular case, where do we draw the line?
Right.
Where do we say that, like, hey, this is permissible, this is not? And I'd say that one of the main reasons that we're even having this discussion is that it's an open question
Hmm.
of at what point does government intervention become no longer guaranteeing freedom but stepping on that freedom? Well, I would say as a rule of thumb, the rights that you have that are guaranteed to you as a US citizen or permanent resident do not guarantee your right to prevent somebody else of exercising their rights. Your right to free speech does not extend to shouting down someone else
Mhm.
or bullying somebody else. Your right to bear arms does not extend to going into somebody else's house and taking their guns away. So, in this particular case, I think that, we talked about freedom, and I'd also like to talk about tolerance and how tolerance has a paradoxical nature similar to freedom. Just as freedom must be circumscribed, tolerance must be as well. Um, to tolerate everything is to include to tolerate the intolerant. So
Right.
you are tolerating the refusal to tolerate others. And so absolute tolerance leads to complete intolerance. You must choose what you tolerate. And I think the question on my mind, as it has been on the mind of many American Jews, is why Columbia and Harvard and UPenn and all these other places chose to tolerate the antics and criminal behavior of these terrorist sympathizers when they could have obviated all of that by simply enforcing their own rules.
That to me is one of the most important pieces.
Yes,
That is something that I think is so, there's two pieces of that. One is, as we've looked at the rules that already exist, going back to this idea of private space, right, at Columbia, like they already have rules for this.
yes,
And look, it bothers me to no end that, as we've talked about before, there are lots of things that have been spoken out against and deemed intolerant, right? Shaming
yes,
people for their bodies, shaming people for their gender or their gender identities, right? Shaming people for um, wealth or lack thereof, shaming people for, I mean, any number of things. These are things that, none of us doubts. I mean, not to mention race or many other religious expressions, right? Um, so that piece of there already exists rules and laws about this, to which all the students on the campus. Now, we know that there were
yes,
plenty of people who weren't students, but all the students on the campus, by being enrolled in that school, they've signed,
yes,
they've agreed to.
yes,
So the rules are, it's not even like you have to like come in and say, hey, you didn't know, that these rules, you signed to them, right? Your name's
yeah.
on this, right? And that's the piece that really, really gets me, I try to manage my anger, but it gets me angry because it just the only thing that it the only way I can understand it is anti-Semitism.
I think that you just gave the short answer to to your own question. That, hey, if these institutions had simply enforced their own rules, we wouldn't be in this situation of, the government having to come in off the top rope and enforcing the rules for them.
Yeah.
I think it's a sad irony that universities like Harvard, where Claudine Gay promulgated a memo with rather stiff penalties for such speech offenses as fat phobia. Well, she suddenly turned into a free speech libertarian as soon as that hate speech was directed against Jews. I think we're all entitled to wonder why. And I think that Columbia University, among others, has a lot to answer for.
Well, there's an infrastructure in the world that I think supports too much Jew hatred. It
Mm,
supports too much paranoia against Jews. And I know there's probably people who are watching this who think, well, it's just the go-to, right? But when you just don't have another rational explanation, at some point, it's just like, it doesn't feel like anything but that
yeah,
because it's so irrational. It's the ultimate irrationality of life. So,
yes.
Well, we're going to continue doing these Cooler Heads episodes. We're going to try to aim at making them about 15 or 20 minutes.
How
And
do we do this time, Rabbi?
I was going to check. I don't know, but I think we're about there. What time did we get? Yeah, I think we might be 20-ish or a little bit more. I don't know. I'll see once we get done. But and to those of you who are watching, please let us know if you have questions. Please like us on YouTube or in the app that you're using to listen to us. We really appreciate your listening, your watching, your feedback. We want to know what it is you'd like to hear about that we can help you develop and keep cooler heads. Thanks, George.
Thanks, Rabbi.